It was August 1942, and an Italian artillery sergeant named Giuseppe Bellini was sitting in a slit trench near El Alamein, writing in a notebook that he kept hidden from his officers, because what he wrote in it would have been classified as defeatist talk under the regulations that governed Italian military correspondence. He had been in North Africa for 14 months. He had arrived with the Ariete Division in the summer of 19... He had found instead, over 14 months of desert warfare was an experience that contradicted nearly every assumption his training and his political education had given him. He wrote in his notebook that the desert did not care about destiny. It cared about water and fuel and the specific mechanical reliability of the trucks that brought both. And Italy's army, for reasons that went well beyond the failures of any individual soldier, had less of all three than the British did, and considerably less than the Germans, who were nominally fighting alongside them, but who treated the Italians with a contempt that Bellini found more wounding than anything the British had done to him in combat. This is the story of what Italian soldiers actually experienced and said about the North African campaign, drawn from soldiers' diaries, intercepted letters, post-war memoirs, and the testimony collected from Italian prisoners of war. And it is a story that complicates almost everything that popular memory of the Second World War has assumed about the Italian role in it. The Italian army that invaded Egypt from Libya in September 1940 was, on paper, an imposing force. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded an army of approximately 250,000 men against a British force in Egypt that numbered fewer than 36,000. The numerical disparity should have produced an overwhelming Italian advantage, and the fact that it did not, that the British were able to halt the Italian advance and then in December 1940 launch a counteroffensive that destroyed the Italian 10th Army and took 130,000 Italian prisoners, requires an explanation that goes beyond simple accounts of Italian cowardice or incompetence, accounts that were convenient for British propaganda at the time and that have persisted in popular historical memory ever since, but that the actual documentary record does not fully support. The Italian soldiers who fought and were captured in this campaign were, in the majority of cases, adequately brave and reasonably competent within the constraints of the equipment and doctrine they had been given. The problem was structural, and it was a problem that Italian soldiers identified with increasing clarity as the campaign progressed, even when they lacked the vocabulary or the political latitude to state it in terms their superiors would have tolerated. Private Alessandro Ferri, captured during the British counteroffensive in December 1940 and held in a prisoner of war camp in India for the remainder of the war, gave testimony after his repatriation in 1946 that historians studying the Italian military experience in North Africa have found unusually candid, perhaps because the distance of years and the safety of a war definitively over had removed the constraints that had governed what Italian soldiers could say while the fighting continued. Ferri described an army whose equipment had been designed and in many cases manufactured for conditions that bore no resemblance to the North African desert. The standard Italian tank, the M13/40, had armor that British anti-tank guns penetrated with what British crews described as disappointing ease, and an engine that the desert's fine sand worked into with a thoroughness that produced mechanical failures at a rate that made sustained mobile operations extremely difficult to maintain. The Italian Air Force's fighters, though flown by pilots whose individual skill British and German observers both respected, were outclassed by the Hurricanes and later the Spitfires that the RAF deployed in increasing numbers, not because Italian pilots lacked courage, but because Italian industry had not produced aircraft that could compete on equal terms with the products of British industry, which had been mobilizing for total war with a comprehensiveness that Italian industrial mobilization never approached.
The deeper problem, the one that Italian soldiers' letters and diaries return to with a consistency that suggests it was widely felt even when it was rarely stated explicitly in terms that named it directly, was the relationship between the Italian war effort and the Italian population that was supposed to sustain it. Mussolini had committed Italy to a war that required the kind of total economic and industrial mobilization that Germany had been building toward for years, and that Britain implemented with remarkable speed once the war began. But Italy's economy in 1940 was not capable of the mobilization the war demanded, and the gap between what the war required.
Captain Eugenio Corti, who served with Italian forces on multiple fronts during the war, and whose post-war memoir became one of the most widely read Italian accounts of the conflict, wrote about the specific psychological burden of fighting a war that ordinary soldiers increasingly suspected their own leadership did not have the material capacity to win, even as official propaganda continued to promise victories that the soldiers in the field had increasing difficulty reconciling with what they were experiencing. Corti described conversations among junior officers in North Africa in which the gap between official communiques and battlefield reality had become a kind of dark professional joke, a recognition shared in private but never stated in any context where it might be reported, that the war Italy was fighting in the desert bore only a loose relationship to the war that Italian radio broadcasts described to the civilian population at home. This gap between official narrative and lived experience produced in many Italian soldiers a particular kind of demoralization that differed from simple fear or fatigue. It was the demoralization of men who had begun to suspect that their sacrifices were not merely costly, but might also be futile, that the war they were being asked to die for was being fought without the basic material preconditions for victory, and that the leadership making this demand understood the situation no better, and in some cases considerably worse, than the soldiers actually facing it in the field. The relationship between Italian and German forces in North Africa, nominally an alliance of equals fighting a common campaign, was in practice shaped by a hierarchy of contempt that Italian soldiers experienced directly, and that their letters and diaries documented with a bitterness that went beyond ordinary inter-service rivalry. General Erwin Rommel, who commanded the Afrika Korps and the combined German-Italian forces in North Africa for most of the campaign, has been remembered in post-war history largely through German and British accounts that treat the Italian forces under his nominal command as a secondary consideration, useful for filling gaps in the line, but not seriously regarded as a fighting force comparable to German units. Italian soldiers were aware of this assessment, encountered it in the specific ways that German officers allocated supplies and assigned missions, and resented it with an intensity that the letters home document repeatedly. Sergeant Bellini wrote in his hidden notebook that the Germans treated Italian units as a kind of expendable auxiliary, useful for holding ground that German forces did not wish to commit their own men to defending, and that this treatment, more than the British enemy or the desert itself, was what had begun to erode his confidence in the entire structure of the campaign. He wrote that he had not expected to be treated this way by an ally, and that the discovery of how Germany actually regarded its Italian partners had changed something in how he understood the war he was fighting.
The Battle of Bir Hakeim in June 1942, in which Italian forces participated alongside German units in an assault on a position held by Free French forces under General Marie-Pierre Koenig, produced documentation that complicates the simple narrative of Italian military inadequacy that has dominated much popular memory of the North African campaign. The Italian Trieste and Ariete divisions fought with a determination that French defenders themselves acknowledged in post-war accounts, and the eventual capture of the position, after the French had successfully delayed Axis forces for over 2 weeks and inflicted significant casualties, reflected genuine Italian combat effectiveness under conditions that Italian equipment and supply limitations made extremely difficult to sustain. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, which produced the decisive Allied victory that ended Axis hopes of controlling North Africa, was experienced by Italian soldiers as the final and most complete demonstration of the material disparity that had shaped the entire campaign. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery had assembled an overwhelming advantage in tanks, artillery, and air support,
an advantage built on the comprehensive industrial mobilization of the British Empire and, increasingly, on American material support that had begun flowing to British forces in the Mediterranean theater in substantial quantities by late 1942. Italian units at El Alamein, including elite formations like the Folgore Parachute Division, fought with a tenacity that British accounts of the battle specifically acknowledge. The Folgore in particular earning recognition from their British opponents for a defense that continued well after the broader Axis position had become hopeless. But tenacity could not compensate for the specific material deficits that had characterized the Italian war effort throughout the North African campaign, and the battle ended in a retreat that became, for the Italian forces involved, a prolonged ordeal of exhaustion and attrition as the Axis armies withdrew westward across hundreds of miles of desert with insufficient transport to move all of the men who needed to be moved.
Sergeant Bellini's notebook, recovered after the war by his family and eventually donated to a regional archive in his home province of Emilia-Romagna, ends with an entry written in early November 1942, during the retreat from El Alamein. He wrote that he had stopped believing in the Empire sometime in the previous year, though he could not identify the specific day this had happened, and that what remained for him now was not faith in any larger cause, but the much narrower and more immediate question of whether his unit could find enough fuel to keep moving west ahead of the British pursuit. He wrote that this narrowing of concern, from empire to fuel, from historical destiny to the mechanical reliability of a specific truck, was probably the most honest measure of what the desert campaign had actually taught Italian soldiers like himself. The desert had not cared about Mussolini's speeches or Rome's ancient claims to Mediterranean dominance. It had asked only the practical questions that any harsh